Walla Walla in the 1930s. Hard times, hopeful times. The stock market crash in 1929 ended the optimistic, upbeat prosperity of the Roaring Twenties and started the downward economic spiral we have come to call the Great Depression. The Depression hit harder in the eastern United States, where 1 in 4 was unemployed. Employers' response to the Depression was to cut wages or lay off their employees. Herbert Hoover was president at the beginning of the Depression, and even though he instituted public works programs similar to those that would be created by the next president, Hoover was unwilling to run up a budget deficit to fund welfare programs. In the eastern United States, people lining up for blocks to receive soup or bread was a common sight. Walla Walla had hungry people too, though, and a so-called soup kitchen was set up in the alley near the Montgomery Ward store. Across the nation, shanty towns were erected by the homeless. Frequently called Hoovervilles, a criticism of President Herbert Hoover, who was reluctant to provide government support for those out of work and hungry. Walla Walla had its own shantytown. Some may have called it a Hooverville, but it was commonly known as the Jungle. Most of the Jungle's residents were transients, men and boys from other parts of the country who traveled looking for work. Some came by foot, others traveled by rail, concealed in boxcars. F.D. Applegate, the director of Walla Walla's YMCA, had compassion for those who suffered the cold and discomfort of the jungle. Applegate offered the Jungle's residents a warm, comfortable place to sleep in the basement of the Y on gym mats. He asked local businesses to contribute apples, candy bars, and cigars. In one 6-day period in 1935, 1,200 men were given a place to sleep. He even provided haircuts and showers. Banks were in trouble throughout the nation, and Walla Walla's banks were affected adversely by fewer deposits and loans that were not paid off. The People's State Bank of Walla Walla closed in 1932. Its president, H. Marshall, took his own life just before its closure. The Union Bank and the First National Bank and Trust declared a 60-day holiday in order to avoid their depositors withdrawing their money. Baker Boyer Bank at first insisted it would not close, but did so after FDR declared a national bank holiday on April 5, 1933. Wheat prices were at an all-time low in the 1930s. During the Depression, drumhellers sold seed on credit to farmers who didn't have the cash. The Depression seriously affected the apple crop of Walla Walla. Farmers were faced with low apple prices at the same time as there was an unusually large proliferation of insects in the area that required expensive sprays to control. A natural disaster struck in 1931 when Mill Creek overflowed its banks. The flood began on March 31st and lasted 3 days. Fed by melting Blue Mountain snows, the raging Mill Creek took out bridges, pushed boulders downtown, overwhelmed the sewer system, and knocked out the water main. Only one person died. He was swept into rushing water while trying to build a dam. But the destruction of streets and property and the clearing of debris posed an enormous task. But despite the hard times, Walla Walla enjoyed a certain prosperity during the 30s. New buildings were erected, such as the First Congregational Church, the Washington Apartments, and Edison School. Cleanup of the flood was aided by the Works Progress Administration. The WPA was one of the 5 principal New Deal emergency relief and public works agencies that began during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidencies and provided jobs for the unemployed. The Civilian Conservation Corps was another of these programs. The CCC had a soil conservation camp on Mill Creek outside Walla Walla. Canneries in Walla Walla were a significant innovation of the 1930s. A pilot cannery was tested and deemed promising. Then in 1933, Walla Walla Canning Company was erected on 7th and Rose. Peas were an especially appropriate crop for the valley due to the nitrogen in its soil, but the company packed asparagus, tomatoes, prunes, and spinach too. By 1936, there were 6 local canneries, and that year they packed 1.9 million cases of peas. Walla Walla's downtown was transformed into a pioneer town as part of the Whitman Centennial Celebration of 1936. The centennial marked the arrival of Marcus and Narcissa Whitman to the Walla Walla Valley in 1836. Local business employees wore costumes. There was a pageant, there were parades, lectures, and bathing beauties. At the Whitman Mission site, a museum was opened. 1937 was the first year of air mail delivery in Walla Walla. Mail was delivered by planes from Portland and Pendleton. By the end of the 30s, Walla Walla was feeling the relief of local and national economic recovery and looked back at the 30s as a time of some hardship and sacrifice, but also a time of significant growth and accomplishment.